Hello, so in January of this year I read Miracle Creek by Angie Kim, and it gave me a lot of thoughts and feelings, and ever since I've been writing a review and it's just been growing longer and longer, and I've been trying to put it off, and I've been putting off actually recording it because I'm waiting till it's perfect, but it's never going to be perfect because ultimately I think that this book is ableist in its choices and its representation, and I don't use that term lightly, and I think that there is a habit of just sort of accusing things of being problematic for the fun of accusing things of being problematic, and that is not what I'm trying to do. I really want to fully explain why I think that this book is ableist. I should make it clear from the get-go that I am not critiquing Angie Kim. I don't know her. She is a person, and I don't know her personally. I don't know her explicit intentions with this book. But ultimately, what I am critiquing is the text itself and what I found within the book itself. Critiquing a book is not critiquing a person, and I'm just trying to fully explain my interpretation of this book. Especially because this book has been getting a lot of positive reviews, especially, a few years ago when it was first published, and that's how I initially heard about it and wanted to read it. When I first heard about this book, it was described as a legal drama about a medical treatment gone wrong, and that piqued my interest. I thought maybe this would be a book about medical ethics or a House MD-esque medicine detective story, something like that. But that's not really what this book is. It's not really about the medical field at all. It's about regular people who end up entangled in a mystery. It follows a Korean family who immigrated to America and who owns a facility that offers a controversial alternative medical treatment, an H-bot. I'm not going to get into the details about this treatment because I honestly think that's larger than the scope of this video, but in the book, parents with disabled and autistic children who feel left behind by traditional medicine come to this facility in the hopes that it will help their children. Then one day, something goes wrong. A fire is set and there is a massive explosion and multiple people die. This all happens at the beginning of the book. One of the mothers is accused and we follow her trial. The book jumps around different perspectives through their present lives and through their memories of what happened until eventually all is revealed. This book is very set on exploring two things: the experiences of a Korean immigrant family and the experiences of parents, or really especially mums, with disabled and autistic children. Now, I can't speak on the representation of the Korean family or what being an immigrant in America is like. I didn't see any glaring faults with the depiction, but it's not really for me to say. What I want to focus on is the other part of this book, the depiction of disabled and autistic children and their parents. So this is where I state that I am disabled. I have been since I was a child. While I am not as debilitated as some of the characters in this novel, I have had a childhood and now adulthood filled with doctor's appointments, places and parts of my life being inaccessible to me, the education system being unaccommodating, and, daily ableism and skepticism of my worth as a person. The list goes on. This video isn't about me or my illness, but my experience in life definitely informed how I've evaluated this book, so I felt it important to mention. So with that said, I think Miracle Creek is ableist, and I don't just want to put that accusation out there and leave it hanging. I really want to discuss the book and explain why I think that is. But to do that, I do have to talk about spoilers. Now, this book is marketed as a mystery novel, and I'm going to have to spoil certain plot points that happen in the latter stages of the book. It's just kind of unavoidable if I want to properly talk about what happens. I'm not going to spoil the main mystery plot. However, I will be talking about major plot developments that happen at the end of the book. So, what actually happens in this book? I'm not going to go through all of the plot. There is a fair bit in this book. I'm going to focus on the character of Elizabeth. She is a mother with an autistic boy called Henry. She abuses Henry physically and verbally, and he is one of the people who die in the accident, and Elizabeth is the person put on trial for causing the accident, for setting the fire. Now, again, spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about spoilers. Elizabeth didn't actually start the fire. She's being falsely accused of causing the accident. So let's start with the treatment of her son. I'm just going to run down some of the things that Elizabeth has done to Henry. Elizabeth scratches and pinches him repeatedly. She verbally berates him, and she passes him from treatment to treatment no matter how tired or exhausted he is. Here are some quotes. She wanted to scream in Henry's ear, to grab and shake him hard and fast and break him out of the world he was trapped in, make him look at her. Her face felt hot, her fingers tingled. "Henry, you need to stop. Right now," she said in a whispered yell, then moved to shield her hand from everyone's view and squeezed his shoulders. Hard. He paused, but only for a microbeat, and then he resumed rocking. She squeezed harder, forcing the soft flesh between his neck and shoulder into a thin strip and pinching, harder and harder, wanting, needing to hurt, for him to scream out or hit her or run away, something to indicate that he was alive in the same world as hers. At bath time, when she took off Henry's shirt and saw the crescent-shaped break in his skin, the splotch of red under the surface, when she tucked him in and kissed his head, praying she hadn't harmed his psyche irreparably. But before all that, in that moment, as Elizabeth pressed her fingers together, all she felt was a release. Not the sudden release of slamming a door or hurling a plate, but a slow, gradual dissipation of her fury, giving way to pleasure, the sensuous delight of squeezing something soft, like kneading dough. When Henry finally stopped rocking and twisted away, his mouth scrunched in pain, his eyes looking directly into hers, the first deep, sustained eye contact he'd made with her in weeks, maybe months. She felt power coursing through her and exploding into elation. Her pain and hatred shattered into tiny shards she could no longer feel. Later on in the book, there's this quote. The camp teacher said the cat scratches on Henry's arm were hurting him, so they applied ointment and bandages. The friend was confused because Henry doesn't have cats, but she didn't say anything. Teresa remembered seeing scratches too, on Henry's upper left arm, dotted lines of red where the blood vessels had burst in spots. Elizabeth had noticed Teresa noticing and said Henry got some sort of bug bite and couldn't stop scratching. There was nothing about cats. Then later, she said she complimented Henry once and he said, "But I'm annoying. Everybody hates me." She asked why he thought that and he said, "My mummy told me." Then later, she remembered Elizabeth telling him to stop talking non-stop about rocks. She'd crouched so her face was next to his, nose to nose, and whispered, "I know you're excited, but you're talking and talking out loud to yourself. That's extremely annoying to most people, and if you keep doing that, I'm worried that everyone will hate you. So you need to try really hard to stop, okay?" And then later, it was just for a moment, one she'd regret and cry over later, but right then she hated her 5-year-old son for having autism, for making everything so hard, for making her hate him. "Stop being a crybaby right fucking now," she said, and slammed the sauna door. He didn't know what fucking meant, and she never used that word, but there was something so satisfying about saying it. The aggressive percussiveness of the F and K sounds spitting from her mouth, and combined with the slam, that was enough to release her rage and calm her. She wanted to run back and say Mummy was sorry and cradle him, but how could she face him? Better to pretend it never happened, to wait for the half-hour timer to ding, then praise him for being brave, with no mention of the crying or screaming. All the ugliness vaporized away. Okay, so it's me talking again. Now, obviously from these quotes, the book isn't unaware of the badness of these actions, right? Like, in fact, these sorts of passages are used in the first half of the book as an indication that Elizabeth might be guilty of setting the fire, as she dislikes her son, Henry died in the fire, maybe she said it because she's abusive to him. Remember, we don't know who set the fire at this point in the book, and that's the main mystery of the novel. But even though the book is aware that these actions are bad and it doesn't necessarily condone them, there are two problems. The first is that the book also puts forward many defenses of these actions. Now, these are in the context of, the in-book defense attorney defending Elizabeth and putting forward explanations of this behaviour. The book uses these trial scenes to kind of show how any lawyer is going to twist things and try and use whatever is available to them to try and form the narrative that they want. The problem is that the book kind of puts forward a false equivalency. The people trying to prove that what Elizabeth did is wrong are not on the same scale as the people who are trying to prove that what Elizabeth did wasn't really that bad and actually she's a loving mother. This is a section from one of those trial scenes. Quote, "My question is, after 5 days of investigation, did you or did you not find Elizabeth to be an abuser posing a credible threat of serious harm to Henry? We did not." End quote. The second thing that this book does, and this is the big one, is that Henry gets better. Henry's autism gets smaller to the point where he may not even be considered autistic anymore. And I am using the book's words to describe this, not mine. Quote, "A dozen others in her autism mums group were on the biomed track, had been for years. The difference between Henry, he was the holy grail of biomed treatments, the so-called super responder. 1 week, after Elizabeth removed food dyes, Henry's rocking went from an average of 25 to 6 episodes per day. 2 weeks after starting zinc, he started making eye contact." Then later, "Having a child recovered from autism was like having one in remission from cancer or recovered from alcoholism. Being on guard for signs of anything abnormal, anything that may mean he's slipping back, while trying not to slip into paranoia, forcing a smile when others congratulate you for beating the odds, while anxiety churns in your stomach as you wonder how long this reprieve will last." And then a little later, this is another in-courtroom scene. "Well, going from autism to no autism is better, not worse, right? Well, actually, the neurologist indicated he may have been misdiagnosed because the improvement in Henry's condition was so vast as to be unaccountable otherwise, because most kids don't improve the way Henry did, right? Well, in any case, he stated that large amounts of speech and social therapy were most likely responsible for the improvement. The large amounts of therapy that Elizabeth insisted on, arranged for, and drove him to every day, you mean," Shannon said, depicting Elizabeth once again as Mother of the Year. But instead of annoying Matt, it made him think. Had he been wrong? Had there been a reason for Elizabeth's obsessiveness? And had that obsessiveness caused a boy to go from autism to not autism? And then later on, another quote. "In the autism mum's world, though, Elizabeth was a rock star, a miracle worker, the leader of the in-crowd, because she was what everyone dreamed of becoming, the mother of a recovered child. A child who started out as a non-verbal, non-social, non-presentable mess like the others, but over the years catapulted into the realm of mainstream classes and therapy graduations. Henry had been the role model, the crystallization of the hope that one day their own kids could undergo their own metamorphosis." End quote. And the fact that Henry gets better is used as a way to sort of justify Elizabeth's treatment. Well, she can't be that bad of a mum if she cared about him so much that he got better, right? But the author decides on every aspect in a book. Henry getting better was a choice by the author. Elizabeth basically just abuses her son until he magically gets cured of autism. And again, this book frames that as like a both sides of the argument type discussion when it's really not. Elizabeth abused her son, and no amount of quote-unquote improvement of Henry's autism is no justification for that, but the book makes that point repeatedly. So I'd like to take a tangent here and actually talk about Henry and the fact that Elizabeth's methods help fix him. Fix him is within quotation marks. Because lots of autistic people learn to mimic neurotypical people. It's called masking, and it's really exhausting. And it's actually why many people, especially girls and women, can take a long time to get a diagnosis. Now, my interpretation of this story is that Henry didn't get better. He just learned to mask better because he was being abused by his mother. He had deeply harmful incentives as to why to act less autistic. However, I want to be clear that this is me bringing that information to the text. Within the text, there is no mention of masking. Within the text, Henry is cured. Henry gets better because of these methods. And it's used in the book as a major source of justification for Elizabeth's actions, or at the very least, justification for the book's own sympathy of Elizabeth's actions. You know, going back to Elizabeth, the book really leans into the difficulties of raising a disabled or autistic child, which is fair. It is challenging. However, to show the challenges, this book really leans into harmful tropes. namely that it only depicts disabled children as burdens for their mothers. It's like the only way this book knew how to build sympathy for the mums was to make the people with the disabilities into inhuman props. I'm going to talk more about this depiction later and the complexities around it, but I'm mentioning it now because it's an important part of how this book builds up a sympathetic depiction of Elizabeth. So this very sympathetic depiction of these mums, what is that depiction balanced with? Well, there are the characters of the protesters. These are other mums who are at the HBOT facility and protest the use of this treatment. However, these protesters are very minor characters. I think only one of them gets a name, and they get very little attention in this book. And the little attention they do get, they are depicted as irrational, unreasonably angry, and even potentially dangerous people. Here is a series of quotes. A tall woman with a silver bob came over. "This strip here is public property. We have a right to be here to stop you. HBOT is dangerous. It doesn't work, and you're just teaching your kids you don't love them the way they are." And then a little later, Elizabeth says, "They're fanatics. Their kids all have autism, and they go around saying how it's the way they're meant to be, and all treatments are evil and sham and kill kids. There's no reasoning with them. We can't let them affect us." And then later, Teresa wished that she could tell the jury not to be fooled by the protesters' supposed peacefulness. They hadn't seen those women that morning, jaws clenched, contempt in their eyes. They looked ready to do anything necessary to stop HBOT, like those fanatics who gunned down abortion doctors in the name of saving lives. So the main protester mum is given the Karen blonde bob haircut, which is of course a pejorative shorthand, and their ideas aren't really explored. Like the protesters are not fully realized characters at all. They're depicted with little nuance or humanity. Their ideas are really dismissed as ridiculous. There are no pro-autism perspectives given any respect in this book. No autistic character who loves their autism and sees it as a part of who they are, because, well, there's no autistic people who have a point of view in this book at all. Again, I will talk more about that later. There's no depiction of a mother who comes to fully accept their child as they are. The only mothers who are given an actual point of view in this book are those who view autism as something to be fixed. In fact, the only mother from even the group of treatment mums who was worried about Elizabeth's behaviour, she died in the accident at the beginning of the novel and thus has no POV. Now, this is a multiple POV book, but Elizabeth has the third largest amount of POV chapters and by far the largest of all of the treatment mums. We live inside her head for a good chunk of this book, and the book grows in sympathy for her. Elizabeth is the one on trial for the murder of her son and other people. And of course, it's quite a horrific experience because we as the reader learn that she's innocent. So this horrible trial experience is used to build sympathy for Elizabeth, especially as we near the end of the book. Quote, "The jurors started talking about Elizabeth, how creepy she was, and what nerve showing her face here in front of people whose lives she'd ruined. They stood to leave and glared down at Elizabeth in unison, like a gang, the same expression of disgust on their faces, the beautiful uniformity of it, as if it had been choreographed." And then later, "What would that feel like, to be told that someone you know, maybe even a friend, had accused you of child abuse?" The book spends a lot of time really telling and showing us how horrible this experience is for Elizabeth. And Elizabeth does show remorse and guilt for her abuse of Henry. She knows what she did was wrong. And it's at this point of the book where the book is sort of at its most sympathetic for her that it is revealed that Elizabeth had planned to stop abusing Henry. Quote, "And Elizabeth knew she needed to stop the therapies, the treatments, all the running around, stop the hating, the blaming, the hurting. The rest of the afternoon she spent in giddiness. She swallowed, told Henry to hurry, and tried to think of tomorrow. Tomorrow, everything would change." End quote. But it just so happens that the very day that Henry dies was the day that Elizabeth decided that she was going to stop all this horrific treatment of him. But then, of course, he dies, and Elizabeth was robbed of the chance to actually stop abusing him. That is how it is framed. Not only is this incredibly contrived, but it's also used as part of the stepping stone towards her absolution. Elizabeth never actually stopped abusing Henry. She just thought about it and then was robbed of the chance of actually acting on it. This isn't framed as an abuser making a commitment to change and then struggling to do it. For all the book depicts, Elizabeth was going to stop abusing Henry because she just decided to. There's no complexity there. That is really not exploring what abuse is actually like and how much work it takes to change abusive relationships. It creates this weird dynamic where, because Elizabeth was going to stop abusing Henry, the book ends up kind of dripping in sympathy for her. Quote, "In this alternate universe where Henry hadn't died, after dinner and wine at home, Elizabeth would be curling up with Henry on the sofa marathon, watching Planet Earth, when Teresa would call about the fire, and she'd cry for her friends and kiss Henry's head and thank God she'd decided to stop. And just today, and months later, driving back from Ruth Weiss's murder trial, she'd shudder to think how she almost went to that last dive just to spite that woman. None of that happened, of course. Instead, she identified her son's corpse, picked out a coffin and gravestone, was arrested for his murder, and read op-eds debating whether she belonged in a nut house or on death row." End quote. Do you see how this book is framing this all as a tragedy for her? Elizabeth never got the chance to stop abusing her son, and that's really sad for her. Elizabeth is racked with guilt and shame for what she's done to Henry, but again, this whole framing is about sympathizing with and humanizing Elizabeth. Her abuse is about how it makes her feel. Quote, "When the prosecutor announced he'd be seeking the death penalty, that's when she realized going through the trial would be the best atonement for her sin. To publicly and officially be blamed for Henry's death, to be forced to sit through the details of his suffering, then to be killed by poisons injected directly into her blood, the exquisite torture of it all." And then later, Shannon, Elizabeth's lawyer, said, her words finally losing that veneer of forced calmness, "I can argue it till I'm blue in the face, but if the jury thinks you hurt Henry, they won't want to side with you, no matter who they think really set the fire. They'll want to punish you. Then let them. I deserve it anyway. I won't let you bring innocent people into this." "But they—" "Stop," Elizabeth said. "I want this over. I want to plead guilty." "What? What are you talking about?" "I'm sorry, I really am, but I can't do this anymore. I can't go back in there for one more second." And then later, Young could see that Elizabeth was feeling ashamed and alone. And then later, Elizabeth thought it was she, with her pride and hatred and indecision and miserliness, who'd caused Henry's death. The book really builds to a crescendo of sympathy for Elizabeth, and that's when she commits suicide. Now, obviously, suicide is tragic, but it's used in this book as this kind of twisted way of absolving her. The book ends with the chapter of Young, who is really the moral heart of the book. She's the only main character who doesn't have a super big secret that's revealed, and she's tied in first place for the most POV chapters of any character. The reader spends a lot of time with her and with her perspective. And the book ends with this character absolving Elizabeth. Quote, "Elizabeth is innocent. She lost her child and she's on trial for killing him. No one deserves that kind of pain." End quote. Because it becomes apparent to the characters in the book that Elizabeth didn't set the fire and is innocent, the tone bleeds into making Elizabeth innocent for everything, even though her abuse was revealed in the trial. Quote, "If she did child abuse but she did not start the fire, do you think she deserves punishment? Not death penalty, but prison?" "I don't know," Teresa sighed. "She's lost her only child in a horrific way. The entire world blames her. She's lost any friend she's had. She has nothing left in her life. So if all that happened and she didn't set the fire, I'd say that's enough punishment for anything she's done." This is coming from the character Teresa, who is also presented as quite a moral, good character. In fact, after Elizabeth dies, the money in her will, it goes to forming an autism support centre called Henry's House. Now, this wasn't Elizabeth's decision, it was Young and Teresa's, but there is a plaque with Henry and Elizabeth's name that's going to be hung up in this support centre. Quote, "I got something," Teresa handed Young a bag. It held 3 portraits in matching wooden frames, plain but stained a deep rich brown. Elizabeth, Henry and Kit, with their names and dates of birth and death inscribed on the bottom. "I thought we could put them in the lobby, under the dedication plaque," Teresa said. A lump formed in Young's throat. "It is beautiful, very appropriate." Now, obviously, I can't just extract quotes that depict the entirety of the tone of a book, but I'm trying to use these quotes to show you that the tone of the final chapters, it is one of absolution for Elizabeth. This is depicted as a sort of just ending somehow. I'm actually okay with morally grey characters. I enjoy reading about them, but only if they're presented as morally grey characters. But by the end of this book, Elizabeth isn't presented as a morally grey character. She is presented as someone who is absolved, a tragic figure of self-sacrifice and missed opportunities. The book is framed around her tragedy, not the life her son was forced to lead. Structurally, the book doesn't treat Elizabeth as a morally grey character. Alright, so this part I'd like to talk just about a couple of other things that happen in the book. Firstly, on the character of Matt. Matt is in his 30s and he sexually assaults a 17-year-old girl called Mary in this book. Now, the book is clear that what he did was wrong. However, it wasn't even labelled as sexual assault until the very end of the book, and the perspective of Matt is definitely given precedence over Mary's. I know you can't exactly quantify this sort of stuff, but I've tried just to back up my point. So Matt has 9 POV chapters in this book, which is tied for the most along with Young, who also has 9. Whereas Mary is only given 3 POV chapters, a third of Matt's. I also counted the words given to each character when they think about the sexual assault that happened. From Matt's perspective of the assault, there's 1,243 words, and in that I've included him remembering the assault itself, but also that it leads on to him having a vivid dream of him having even more sex with Mary. From Mary's perspective of the assault, she's given 523 words, less than half of what Matt was given. The book spends far more time seeing Matt's reasoning for the assault rather than how it affects Mary. This isn't as bad as the ableism stuff, but I still found it a bit clunky. The book was not unsympathetic to Mary at all, in the same way that it is to the disabled and autistic children, but the book was still more interested in sympathising with Matt. Another side note I'd like to discuss was the ableism in the courtroom. There was blatant misinformation on connecting vaccines and with autism in this book, and it was not commented upon. These quotes are from another trial scene. Quote, "You can't look at one thing in isolation. It wasn't just H-Bot. She did extreme things like IV chelation and feeding Henry bleach." "Ah yes, let's turn to that. IV chelation is an FDA-approved treatment, correct?" "Yes, but for heavy metal poisoning, which Henry did not have." "Are you aware, detective, of a Brown University study in which mice injected with thimerosal, a mercury preservative that used to be in many vaccines prior to 2001, became socially atypical, akin to autism, and when treated with chelation became normal again?" Matt hadn't heard of that. "Was that true?" "No, I haven't heard of that study." "Really? The study was summarised in a Wall Street Journal article I found in your own files, right next to the sheet noting that Henry had 7 thimerosal vaccines as a baby, back when thimerosal was still present in some vaccines." Heights pursed her lips, as if forcing herself to say nothing. End quote. So when I first read that section, I still wasn't sure where this book was going, and I was like, okay, maybe this book is going to have a different character explain that misinformation, or the book is going to explore how misinformation spreads and its effect. Nope, none of that was done. The misinformation just sat there perpetuating harmful lies. So I'm going to do the debunking that the book couldn't be bothered to do. Quote, "The idea that thimerosal was a causal trigger for autism is now considered disproven, as incident rates of autism increased steadily even after thimerosal was removed from childhood vaccines. There is no accepted scientific evidence that exposure to thimerosal is a factor in causing autism. Under the FDA Modernization Act of 1979, the FDA conducted a comprehensive review of the use of thimerosal in childhood vaccines. Conducted in 1999, this review found no evidence of harm from the use of thimerosal as a vaccine preservative other than local hypersensitive reactions. So let's just take a step back and analyze some of this. The beginning of the novel is better. It presents various opinions in a more neutral way. The rift between the mums going to the treatment and the protesters is more neutrally presented. The HBOT treatment is first explained through the eyes of Matt, who is a doctor and is skeptical of it. And in Elizabeth's first chapter, she is clearly derided for her treatment of Henry. It's a negative portrayal. However, as the book goes on, the tone and attitude of the book itself shifts. Firstly, no skepticism of HBOT is ever voiced again, and the original skeptical voice of Matt is revealed to be that of a sexual abuser. Secondly, the structure of the mystery plot itself was ableist. All mystery books set up various pieces that imply something to the reader, and then as the story goes on, it's revealed how they actually came together, right? That is the hallmark of the mystery genre. But in this book, Elizabeth is at first depicted as abusing Henry, and it's a negative portrayal, and this is presented to the reader as a reason to maybe think that Elizabeth did set the fire. This negative depiction of her abuse is part of the mystery plot functioning. But then, of course, because it's a mystery, Elizabeth didn't actually set the fire. It'd be a pretty boring mystery if she did. So as dictated by the needs of the mystery plot, the more and more sympathetic depiction of Elizabeth comes out as it's revealed she didn't do it. The mystery plot and Elizabeth's absolution is intrinsically linked. So what that means is that this book uses the abuse of an autistic child as a red herring in a murder mystery. Like, that is the utilitarian purpose for having the abuse in the book at all. The big reveal being, you thought she was the murderer because of the horrible abuse she did, but actually she's a deeply sympathetic mum who's just trying her best. That's the transition the book takes, and it's part of the mystery plot. Now, obviously, abuse isn't the same as murder, but it's still really serious. And here's the thing, I don't actually object to using the abuse of a child as a red herring if it is then given the complex depiction it requires. But this book doesn't properly deal with what it sets up. The book's answer to the abuse storyline is, well, just have Elizabeth be swamped in shame and commit suicide. And I think that's really lazy. Not only is it a melodramatic outcome, but it's also skirting the real questions it brings up on Elizabeth's actions. It uses the melodrama to get away with not actually addressing it. It honestly felt like the book did want to explore a mother's guilt of abuse that she caused, but didn't actually know how to do that justice. Abusive people sometimes do want to change, but it takes a lot of work, it's complicated, and it takes time to actually do the work, and it felt like the book actually didn't want to dedicate the time to that topic that it needs. It would have distracted from the mystery plot. But if you don't want to distract from the mystery plot, don't introduce something so complex that is going to take a lot of focus to do well. But instead, the abuse storyline is introduced to facilitate the mystery plot, and then suicide is used as this quick fix ending. In my opinion, this both minimizes the seriousness of child abuse by not properly addressing it, and then minimizes the seriousness of suicide by using it as a cheap exit. I think this is not doing child abuse or suicide any justice in representation. And this book is trying to be serious. This is not some pulpy soap opera romp. This is a book that is taking itself seriously, but then it uses these serious topics in an underdeveloped, exploitative way. And now we've come to what I consider the core of the ableism in this book. First, here is a definition of ableism. Ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. I will link where I got that quote down below. So with that said, the question I want to pose about this book is, who got humanized? The glaring fault of this book is that there are no disabled or autistic POV characters, which is quite an omission in a book so heavily focused on and revolving around disabled and autistic people's lives. It results in these characters being defined by nothing more than their illness. The characters are used as props to further the story, to further the emotional journey of the able-bodied characters, but they get no humanity themselves. They get no arc, they get no personality. The extent of the characterization is that one of the children is really obsessed with Barney the dinosaur. That's it. The rest is a list of their symptoms. Henry is definitely the most depicted of the children, but even his story is completely defined by his abuse. There is no joy, no desires, no grief, no personalization at all. We know nothing of their internal lives because they are just used as plot devices. This book was doing a lot of work to humanize everyone except the actual disabled people. Here's the thing, even if you think the depiction of Elizabeth is okay, the fact remains that this book reduces these disabled characters to nothing more than their illness. There is not a single one of the children who are actually getting the treatment who gets humanized. Every single thing they say or do, which is minimal, is in service of the able-bodied characters' stories, boiling personhood down to just a disability, and having their lives revolve entirely around being fixed. This is what Miracle Creek does, and it's ableist. So here is an example of what I mean. Rose is Teresa's daughter and is in a wheelchair, is nonverbal and needs a lot of care. This is in a scene with her and her mother talking to Young and her daughter Mary. For time, I have slightly truncated the passage. Quote, Rosa closed her lips and hummed, then opened her lips, making a ma sound. Teresa gasped. Did you hear that? She said ma. Can you say it again, my sweet girl? Ma, mama. Rose hummed again, then said ma. Then again, ma. Oh my God! Teresa kissed Rosa all around her face, feathery pecks that made Rosa laugh. Young and Mary laughed too, feeling the wonder of the moment ripple across them, binding them in shared amazement. Teresa put her head back as if in a silent prayer of thanks to God, and Young saw it then, tears streaming down her face. Young felt a jolt of envy. It was ridiculous to feel jealous of a woman with a daughter who couldn't walk or talk, with no college, husband or children in her future. She should feel sorry for Teresa, not envious, she told herself. And yet, when had she felt pure joy like that radiating from Teresa's face? Mary said a warm goodbye to Teresa and Rosa, then turned to leave without saying anything to Young. Young felt her cheeks flush and wondered if Teresa noticed. Young turned to Teresa and forced out a chuckle. Mary is so busy. SAT classes, tennis, violin. Can you believe she is already researching colleges? I guess that is what 16-year-old girls do. For a briefest moment, she'd wanted to hurt Teresa. She'd wanted to inject a dose of dark reality into her bliss and snap her out of it. She'd wanted to remind her all of the things that Rosa should be doing but was not and never would. Teresa's face went saggy, the corners of her eyes and lips drooping dramatically as if some invisible line holding them up had been cut. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. Young reached out to touch Teresa's hands. I was very insensitive. Teresa looked up. It's all right, she said. So I use this example because while it does show, a nice moment between a parent and a disabled child, it's very brief. And once Rosa plays her part in the scene in saying ma, the scene leaves her and really only focuses on what's happening with Young and Teresa's minds. I think this is the only scene I can remember Rosa being prominent in. We barely see her in the book. She gets no further characterization than this. And yet even in this scene, Rosa is there purely to define the other characters' stories. It shows the tension between Young and her daughter Mary, the dissatisfaction Young has with her life, and a gentle growing bond between Young and Teresa. This scene develops nothing about Rosa because she doesn't get a story. If I give this book the benefit of the doubt, I would call it an utterly failed attempt at nuance. The character of Elizabeth is interesting, and I think it could have been amazing if it was handled differently. But this book is just not interested in humanizing autistic kids or kids with disabilities, and You can't have nuance when you ignore that. And I want to be clear here. I am not pitting the depiction of mums with disabled children against depictions of disabled children. They are both important, but they are intrinsically linked. If you depict one, you inevitably depict the other in some fashion. And this book decided that in order to build sympathy for its mum characters, it was going to in turn depict the children with disabilities as inhuman props. They feel like these sacks of sand that these mums are burdened to carry around. And I am not asking for anyone to minimize the hardship that can come from raising kids with disabilities. I am just asking it to be done without minimizing our humanity. Because this book leans on a really harmful trope in life and in media that disabled kids are burdens. Rather than pointing out the lack of societal support for people with disabilities or their families, problematic healthcare systems, capitalism sowing disconnection between people and support systems because lonely people are cheaper labour and easier consumers. This book doesn't go into any of that. It just shows the kids as the problem. And that is why their stories revolve entirely around being fixed. Now, all illness takes management, and sometimes that management can be really challenging. But that doesn't lessen your worth as a person or your ability to experience joy. And it doesn't distill our existence down to only that management. You know, these harmful beliefs exist and can and should be explored in fiction. But in this book, there was no exploration, no critique, and certainly no debunking of misinformation. Anyone with ableist thoughts would not have had them challenged by this book. In fact, they may have had them affirmed, reiterating the belief that young children with disabilities or autism should go to any treatment at any cost to their own happiness. This book failed to show any fully developed love or affection between disabled child and parent because that's impossible to do when the children are not fully realized characters. You know, this book builds the relationship between Mary and Young beautifully. That it was a lovely depiction of the nuances and complexities of a mother-daughter relationship. The disabled kids weren't given the same attention or care. So that brings me to the question, you know, why did no one notice? You know, there were so many booktubers that I watch and respect. They recommended this and they gave it good to fantastic reviews. I don't remember a single one mentioning anything about ableism. Why didn't they notice it? And I mean, I know why. It wasn't malicious. It was just, you know, unawareness. And people aren't going to pick up on things that they aren't socialized to pick up on. I think Miracle Creek is a great example of how ableism is still invisible to most people, you know, especially when it's obfuscated through craft. Everyone is learning. No one is perfect, including myself. You know, I am certain that there are things that I read that misrepresent a group that I don't register because I don't have my radar set to register it. I just think that the fact that this book didn't spark any great discussion or controversy shows that first that this book does sort of hide its ableism within its craft, within the mystery plot. And secondly, that our culture so wholeheartedly accepts these ableist depictions that for most people it's like a fish not noticing the water. I think that ableism was hidden behind the mystery plot and the family drama, that unless you experience the effect of ableism in your life, that you would be less tuned to notice it. You know, as someone who is not able-bodied, it just makes it harder to navigate the waters of recommendations. So, you know, in conclusion, just to critique it as a book, as a mystery plot, I still found this kind of disappointing. You know, it felt, the mystery plot was very contrived by the end. The characters in the book itself agree with me. Quote, "It was almost as if the fates conspired to manipulate that day's events in just such a way. So many pieces had to fit. Everything made sense now. All the pieces fit so elegantly." End quote. You know, somehow a character in the book telling me how to feel about the story and that the story fits together so elegantly, you know, it didn't convince me. However, while I found the structure of the mystery plot kind of underwhelming, I actually do commend Angie Kim's character writing. You know, I reread this book to make this review and get quotes and make sure I wasn't missing something. And when I reread it, it stood out to me how skilled she is at writing from someone's point of view, you know, and humanizing them, you know, and she had some really beautiful descriptions and images in here. She definitely has skill and craft as a writer. None of that skill and craft was pointed towards the disabled children. The question is, whose voices and perspectives were chosen to be developed and included, and whose were excluded? And I think the ableism in this book is kind of built into its utilization of craft. Now, throughout this review, I have focused on Elizabeth and her son Henry, who's autistic, but I am not autistic, and it's really important to listen to autistic people, especially because autism isn't a monolith. Many different people are going to have many different perspectives. And in that vein, I'll just throw you a couple recommendations. The first is a recent video on the film called Music. This video does a great job of breaking down the ableist representation of autism in that film. Also, Mark Rober recently released a video that features his son who's autistic. Now, I know that there is controversy about Mark Rober's video and the subsequent charity stream. I will be honest, I don't know much about the charity stream, but I will link a great video made by Jessie Gender talking about the problematic elements of that charity stream. But I also wanted to link Mark Rober's original video as well because, you know, I do think it does a great job of actually showing a relationship between an autistic child and their parent that is a full relationship between full human and another full human, you know, obviously because they are real people, but you get my point. So both of those videos are linked below. Also, just for fun, I'll link another video by Jessie Gender talking about neurodivergent representation in Star Trek, because I just think it's a really great video. Also, more in the booktube vein, I will recommend this video by Kit's World. They talk about what it's like being a reader as an autistic person and how publishing neglects to publish things written in the rhythm of a neurodivergent brain. I know I have focused on autism in these recommendations, but that's because Miracle Creek's flaws focused around autism. But don't forget, it also had flawed representation of disabled kids, and, you know, that just was a lot less of a focus in the book. Alright, so those were my thoughts on Miracle Creek. You know, I worked really hard on this review because, you know, I don't do a lot of negative reviews. It's not what I find pleasant. And, you know, I take calling something ableist seriously. I wanted to back up my interpretation with a proper explanation. So yes, if you've made it all the way to the end, well done. I thank you very much for watching.